Welcome in the second video in my series of 3 about the full rule set of Successors, a game by Mark Simonich and Richard Berg, about the succession wars following the death of Alexander the Great 2 centuries BC. In our previous video we saw how to win the game. In this second video I'll teach you how it can work on the battlefield, how to gather armies, move them and fight to put your general on Alexander's throne. And first, as you remember, one way to win the game, the military way, involves taking control over provinces. How do you do that? How to control locations and provinces? Each player has tokens to show which locations he controls. So, at a glance on the game map, you can see who controls what. Let's zoom on the province of Phrygia. It is made of 4 locations. 3 are circles, there are minor cities, and 1 is a square, a major city. In other provinces, there are also hexagonal locations, which are strongholds. But for purpose of controlling, all shapes are the same. When a player controls a location, he puts a political control marker on it. Let's call them PCs for political control. To control a whole province, you need to control more than half of its locations. Phrygia is made of 4 locations. Half is 2 locations, but more than half is 3. To avoid mistakes, this is shown as a little white number. Here, green player is controlling 3 locations, so he's controlling Phrygia and earns 3 victory points, the number in the orange box. If there is a major city in the province, you must control this major city in order to control the province. For example here, green player doesn't control Phrygia, even if he controls 3 of its locations. Because Phrygia has a major city, Kelainai, you cannot control the province without controlling its major city. And now, how do you put new PCs, political control markers, on the map? It's easy, but before, you must understand the rhythm of the game, its pace. This is the sequence of play. The game is played in 5 turns. Each turn is shown as the red cycle, which starts with all players drawing 4 Tyche cards each. And then everybody goes in the blue subcycle. In this subcycle, the first player plays 1 Tyche card and activates all his generals. Then, next player does the same. And when all players have played 1 card each, then cycle again the blue subcycle with their second card, then third card, fourth card, and the blue subcycle is over, and back to the red cycle for 1 more turn. And now, let's see how the control of a new location fits into this sequence. Green player would like to take control over the province of Phrygia with an army under General Demetrios. The first way to take control of location is to invade them. So first, General Demetrios moved with his troops to Ancyra, the first location in Phrygia. Movement takes place in the activation segment of the sequence of play. We will see that it can also occur when playing a Tyche card, but either way, it takes place in the second half of the blue cycle. General Demetrios is in Ancyra with his army, but green player's blue cycle is over. Now, all other players play their own blue cycle in clockwise order. And when we are back to green player's turn, he starts a new blue cycle with the surrender segment. During this step, all locations occupied by green armies surrender to green players' control. A green political marker is put on the location and voila, Ancyra now belongs to green players' territory. Just after that, during the same blue cycle, green player can move again to the next location, Gordion, and then wait for the following blue cycle after all other player turns for Gordion to surrender. And so on. As soon as he controls 3 locations, he controls the whole province of Phrygia and earns 3 victory points. It's as simple as that. Once you understand this pace, this rhythm, conquest becomes very easy. And note that it makes no difference if the location is a circle, a square or a hexagon. Okay, but this is for the simplest case, because usually locations are not empty like this. At the beginning of the game, a lot of locations are controlled by independent tribes and populations. These locations are designated by grey PC markers. These PCs don't belong to any player, they are independent. And when you want to conquer independent locations, things take a little longer. At start, this is the same. A green player moves his army into the first location. Then, he waits until his next turn, his next blue cycle. And then, at the surrender segment, the location doesn't automatically turn to green political control. Green player must first subdue people, and this is called a siege. And here comes our first problem, because there is a prerequisite to siege role. The besieging army must have at least 3 combat units. Here, Demetrios came with 2 mercenary combat units. We will see later all existing combat units, but here just remember that brown units are mercenary units and the number on the left is the unit size. So, with only 2 combat units, green player cannot roll for siege, and this independent location will never surrender. Green army can stay there but cannot take control of the location. Okay, so now let's suppose Demetrios came with an army large enough, 3 combat units, he can roll for siege. The procedure is simple. There is a siege table on the game player's aid, 1 die roll, the result comes in 2 numbers. On the left is the number of siege points you get, on the right the number of combat units you lose. With a die roll of 4, green player gets 1 siege point and loses nothing. Okay, 1 siege point, what does it mean? In fact, it depends on the location you besiege. A minor city, a circle, surrenders with just 1 siege point. To subdue a stronghold, a hexagon, you need 2 siege points, and 3 for a major city, a square. Here, 1 siege point is enough to get the control of Ankira. Green player removes the independent PC and puts a green one in its place. So, as you see, it's a little more difficult with independent PCs, but still quite easy. Let's go on with our example. Demetrios moves to the major city of Kelainai, and same process, he waits for the surrender segment and rolls on the siege table because this major city is ruled by independent populations. He rolls a 4 again, but this time, against a major city, it is not enough. So, green player just put a siege point marker to remind that he needs only 2 more to gain the political control of the city. Next surrender segment, green player rolls again, and let's suppose he gets 3. He gains 1 more siege point, but still not enough to subdue the major city. He also loses 1 combat unit, and with 2 left, he has not enough troops to meet the siege prerequisite of 3 combat units. And so now, Demetrios will stay there, waiting for reinforcement before being able to resume his siege. If he ever leaves the location, all cumulated siege points are lost and must be earned again by subsequent siege rolls. Now it's time to summarize all we know in a handy table, and add a last column for the last possible case. What if the location is already controlled by another player? For a minor city or stronghold, it is exactly as if the location was empty. But for a major city, you must accumulate 3 siege points before taking control. And that's it. But you could argue that it is a slow process and you would like to have other ways to conquer territories much faster than that. First, for independent locations and enemy major cities, the red cells, you can buy bonus siege rolls during your army's movement. As we will see very soon, during movement, an army spends movement points. And so, for a cost of 2 movement points, the army can make a siege roll. And this happens during the activation segment of the blue cycle. So, you don't have to wait until the next turn surrender segment. Fine, but during movement it is a little less efficient. If you accumulate enough siege points, you remove the independent or enemy PC from the location, but you don't put one of yours in its place. The same with enemy minor cities. This one doesn't require any siege roll, this is a green cell in the table, but still you can remove the enemy PC for 2 movement points. And again, you don't replace it with your own PC. And if you have 4 movement points, you can roll for siege twice. And thus, you can clean up a province from independent or enemy PCs, but without taking control of it. If you want the control, you must wait until the surrender segment, and it will be only for the location your army is in, of course. Okay, now a good news. If you are not patient enough, and if you just removed independent or enemy PCs without replacing them with your own, you have still a solution to take control of these locations. And this happens when you play your Tyche card. As we will see later, some Tyche cards have an operation value on their top left corner. With this value, you can do a lot of different things, but if you use it for political control, this operation value is the number of PC markers you can put on the map. And then, you can put these PC markers only on empty locations, minor cities, strongholds, or major cities, no matter, but empty without any independent PC, nor enemy PC, nor enemy combat unit. And you can put new PCs markers only within 2 movement points of any PCs you had on the map before playing the Tyche card. Let's take an example. At the time green player plays this Tyche card, here is what the map looks like. With 3 operation points, he can put 3 PCs on empty locations on the map. He can count the 2 movement points range from his existing PC in Ankira. He cannot put a PC in the major city because it is not empty. There is a yellow PC already. He cannot either in the stronghold because his 2 movement points path would cross an enemy army and this is not allowed. No enemy PC and no enemy combat units. He can put a PC in these 2 locations and in this other one 2 movement points away. Note that it is impossible to put a PC here because even if this location is adjacent to a green PC, it is more than 2 movement points away from any PC that was already on the map before playing the Tyche card. You cannot change the placement of PCs. All of them must originate from an already existing control. Okay, and so you begin to understand how it can work. Moving your generals, you remove enemy and independent PC by spending movement points, and then you spend the Tyche card to put your own PCs on the emptied locations. And finally, there's the last tool you must know, isolation. Let's recall the general sequence of play. During a full game of Successors, players play 5 game turns. They pass 5 times through the red cycle. And every such red cycle ends with an isolation phase. This phase, thus, happens only 5 times during the whole game. Its goal is to check the geographical consistency of each player's territory. The rule is simple. Every PC marker on the map must be linked to either any major city controlled by this player or one of his combat units. A controlled major city is a major city, a square location, with a PC marker from the player. A combat unit is any unit able to fight, usually inside an army that is under the command of a general. Any PC without such a link is isolated and thus is eliminated at the time of isolation phase. On this example, we are at the end of a turn, its isolation phase. Let's consider yellow player. He has a controlled major city and an army full of combat units. These 2 locations are the political centers to where he must link all his PCs. He must link them through any kind of path, whether by land or by sea, whether through a solid connection or a dotted line. An enemy army doesn't block the path if it is on a friendly PC marker. As soon as there is a yellow PC marker, we can trace a path. So here, this PC unlocks the way to all the southernmost PCs, even through the Transmediterranean links. All links are valid. The path is blocked by enemy PC, so this northern yellow PC cannot link to the yellow army. But your path can go through uncontrolled areas, so this same location can trace a valid link back to the yellow major city. Finally, the two easternmost yellow pieces cannot be linked to either political center, they are isolated. Let's see red player now, because remember, isolation phase is at the end of the whole turn, so it is not linked to any particular player. Isolation is checked for all players at the same time. Red player has two political bases, a red major city and a red army, and so both his pieces are easily linked. Note that it doesn't matter that red army is on a yellow PC. Note also that he could not have traced a link through the independent PC. An independent PC is not a friendly PC, so only red PC for red player. And what about blue player? He can only link his PCs to his blue army. He controls no major city. The three PCs close to this army are easily connected. But the other one to the west is isolated. The path cannot go through an enemy army if there is no blue PC on the location. A path can go through an uncontrolled location only if it is empty. And finally, there are two blue PCs left that are clearly isolated. But here is the last tricky point. The two yellow PCs that block the link to blue's army are also isolated. So if you consider they will disappear, this clears the way and makes the two blue PCs valid. But the other way is also true. If you consider that blue PC are isolated, their elimination clears the way for yellow PCs. So, who is right? Well, it depends on who plays first. Because isolation phase is for all players together, but it is played in player order. So let's suppose yellow player plays first. He must check isolation first, so he removes all his isolated PCs. And then, when it's blue's turn, his PCs are not isolated anymore, and he doesn't have to discard them. We will see in next video what is the player order and how it can change, but for the moment, just remember that player order is very important when it comes to isolation. Okay, now you know how to take control of locations, then provinces, you know how to build a true empire and how to use isolation to cut your enemy's network and dissolve parts of their territories to your own advantage. In other words, you know how to earn victory points because provinces are victory points, so you know how to win the game. But there is a problem. There are other players and they try to expand their political network on the map just as you are. So you understand that you will need armies and combat units to defend your network and to conquer your neighbors. There are a lot of possible combat units. Here they are, all available combat units in the game. The same units for all players. There are no red, green or yellow units. And in fact, there are only 5 different units. Mercenaries, elephants, loyal Macedonian units, royal army troops and the famous silver shields. The multiple counters are just there to make change. For example, these are 5 mercenary combat units, but these same 5 units can be represented as these 3 counters, and that's exactly the same strength. On the counter, the number on the left is the number of combat units, the number on the right, in parentheses, is the strength of the unit. For mercenaries, each combat unit is worth 1 strength point. Loyal Macedonian units are twice as valuable because 1 unit is worth 2 strength points. The same for Royal Army Troops, the unit with a purple ribbon. And the silver shields are the strongest ones with 3 strength points per combat unit. Elephants are special units whose strength is not fixed and can vary from battle to battle. Okay, so only 5 different combat units, very simple. They come in 2 colors because, as we will see very soon, brown units are very volatile and very easy to lose through battle, while white units are more steady and will erode much more slowly. You can lose all your brown units in just 1 battle, while you will never lose more than 2 or 3 white units. Now, as I just said, there are no red, green or yellow units, and that's because units always belong to an army, and an army is embodied by its general. Here is Antigonos. Each general has his own card and a plastic figure to show where he is actually on the map. Antigonos is in Kelainai, capital city of Phrygia. Every general has a colored base which shows to which player it belongs. Antigonos belongs to red player. Combat units are put on Antigonos card. They constitute Antigonos army. Here, Antigonos stays in Kelainai with an army of 2 mercenary units and 1 loyal Macedonian for a total strength of 4, the parenthesis numbers. The ratings on Antigonos' card and on his plastic figure are his initiative rating in a circle and his battle rating in a square. The lower his initiative, the more this general will easily move and combat with his army. The higher his battle value, the stronger he will be in battle. Every general has also a special capability, more on that later. In a 5-player game, each player starts with 2 generals. These generals can be killed in battle, and in such case, the player can recruit another general to replace him, but he cannot recruit a 3rd general if his former 2 are still alive. 2 generals per player and that's it. We will see that there are exceptions to this rule, but more on that later. These 2 generals are called major generals. Players also have a reserve of 4 minor generals. These are generic counters, no plastic figures. Minor generals have generic rating, an initiative rating of 4 and a battle rating of 2. These are the worst ratings a general can have. They are used exactly like major generals, but they are immediately replaced when they are killed. A player always has 4 minor generals at any time. In fact, minor generals are handy to manage small detachments of units. Every time a major general wants to let units on the field, as an outpost or a city garrison for example. Here, Antigonos stays in the city of Pella with 3 combat units, 2 mercenaries and 1 loyal Macedonian. He can move from the city, but leaving 1 mercenary behind as garrison. He then puts a minor general from his reserve on Pella to take care of the garrison. There is no card for the minor general, so he stays on the map with his combat units under him. In this example, in the following surrender segment, both Pella and Amphipolis surrender to red control as we just saw before. Next move, Antigonos can go back through Pella to Tyche, picking up the mercenary on the way. He takes his minor general back because he doesn't need him anymore. This is what minor generals are made for. They can move combat units, lead them to battle just as major generals do, but with lower ratings. They are generic and interchangeable, so very convenient but limited to 4 per player. Okay, and now how do players move their generals and troops? How do they fight enemy forces? Remember the sequence of play. The heart of the game is here, activate all generals. On each blue cycle that is 4 times per turn, each player in player order can activate all their generals. Activate means move and fight. When it is his activation segment, a player can activate all his generals, major and minor. He can even create a minor general on the go to detach troops from an army. Generals are activated one by one. You must complete the activation of one general before the activation of another. And no unit of any kind can move twice. For example, red player cannot move Antigonos to Peukestas, take the mercenary unit with Peukestas and move him further. He cannot do that because the mercenary unit would have moved twice. Okay, that being said, how does troop movement work? At the beginning of his own activation segment, the player, here red player, rolls 1 die and looks at the movement allowance table. This gives the number of movement points for each of his generals according to their initiative rating. Here, red player rolls a 3. He puts the die on the table as a reminder. Antigonos gets 4 movement points and Peukestas 3. 1 die for all his generals and all his activation segment. Each player rolls his own die at the beginning of his own activation segment. Let's move Antigonos first. The rule is simple. A solid link is a road, it costs 1 movement point. A dotted link is a pass in the mountain or a strait across water, it costs 2 movement points. So, Antigonos moves to Tarsos for 1 movement point, then north to Iconion. He must first move to a transit point for 2 movement points through the mountains, then 1 movement point again to Iconion. A transit point is a valid location, an army can stop and stay on it, but it is useless in terms of political control. You cannot put a PC on a transit point. Peukestas can move to Issos for 1 point, then Tarsos for 1 point again, and then he cannot walk through the mountains because he only has 1 movement point left. Another example, back to the beginning of the activation segment. For 1 movement point, Antigonos can go the other way toward Peukestas. Then, the 2 generals cannot stay like this on the same location. When 2 generals or more share the same location, one must take the lead and the other becomes his subordinate. And it is not a choice for the player. He must comply with general seniority. This is this little number on the bottom right of general cards. With a seniority of 12, Antigonos must take the lead. Peukestas is immediately put on Antigonos' card. All their combat units now make a single army led by Antigonos. Peukestas and his ratings are useless as long as he stays with Antigonos. Antigonos goes on with his move, 2, 3, 4 movement points. Both generals and all their combat units did move, so red player's activation segment is over. Another example, back again to the beginning. Red player could move the other way. He first activates Peukestas with 3 movement points. 1. Both generals now share the same location, so Antigonos, with his higher seniority, takes the lead. Even if Peukestas was the activated general. Then Antigonos can go on. Beware, this is not a new activation. Peukestas was activated, he picked up Antigonos, but Antigonos, having a higher seniority, takes the lead to go on within the same activation. He has 4 movement points, but remember, 1 movement point was already spent by Peukestas. So there are 3 movement points left. 1, 2, 3. The army cannot go as far as Iconion. One more example, Antigonos can walk through Peukestas without picking him up. Then Peukestas, not yet activated, can move with his 3 movement points. Now, if during the same move Antigonos drops 1 loyal unit to Peukestas' army when going through it, when red player activates Peukestas, he has a problem because in his army there is a combat unit that already have moved. Peukestas cannot move at least with this unit. If he chooses to let it there, then he can move. So he uses a minor general to take care of the unit and leaves the location with the rest of his army. Another way to use minor generals. Antigonos would like to split his army to move to Iconion and Aspendos. If he goes to Tarsos, then drops a part of his army under a minor general, and then goes on to Iconion, the minor general cannot move again toward Aspendos because a dropped unit cannot move anymore. But Antigonos can do otherwise. First, he cuts his army in 2 parts. One under his own command and the other under a minor general. Then, red player activates Antigonos and moves him to Iconion for 4 movement points. The loyal Macedonian units with the minor general were not dropped. We use the term drop-off only if it occurs during a movement. Now, red player activates the minor general, but beware, with an initiative rating of 4. He just has 2 movement points. 1, and he must stop. Okay, and now you see how you can use minor general for troops detachment. Minor generals work exactly like major generals. They are just far less efficient. They can be created and eliminated at will as long as there are never more than 4 of them on the map. There are blue dotted lines that cross the sea. Moving along them is called naval movement, more on that later. Don't forget also that with 2 movement points, a general can remove an enemy political control marker or roll for a siege on an independent control location or an enemy major city. Here, Antigonos enters Issos for 1 movement point. Then he spends 2 more to remove the green PC and then spends his last movement point to end in Tarsos. If Issos is independent instead of green controlled, this is the same cost but with a siege roll needed. 1 Antigonos moves to Issos, 2 and 3 he rolls on the siege table, but he misses, so he doesn't remove the independent PC and he chooses still to go on to Tarsos. Remember that if Antigonos chooses to stay in Issos, next turn at the surrender segment, there will be again an automatic and free siege roll, and if this siege roll is successful, red player replaces the independent PC with one of his own. Siege is always more efficient during surrender segment, but you have to stop and wait for the next surrender segment, tough choice. And finally, a last word about strongholds. You remember, strongholds are hexagonal locations. They represent special places where local populations are strong and willing to defend their ground. So, first, we already saw that if an army stops in an independent stronghold, it requires 2 siege points to remove or replace the grey PC marker. 2 instead of 1 for a regular minor city. But more than that, if the army decides to ignore the independent stronghold and marches through it, it must make an attrition roll. You look at the attrition table from the player head. As noted under the table, attrition rolls for passing through an independent stronghold is always made on column 2, the shaded column. Here, the player rolls a 6 and loses 1 combat unit. He chooses to lose a mercenary. And that's all for the independent strongholds. More difficult to besiege and dangerous to pass through. Note that this is not the same if the stronghold is under a player's control. In this case, you don't need any siege roll to take control of it, and you don't suffer any attrition if you pass through it. And that's it. You know how to move troops through the activation of your generals. But, as you might fear, you are not alone in the race for Alexander's succession. There are 4 other players like you, and sooner or later you will be confronted to their ambition. Sooner or later you will have to fight. First, battle is part of the activation process. As it moves, an army must stop if it enters a location with an enemy army. That is, any army that belongs to another player. In fact, this is not exactly true. An enemy player can let you pass through his army without fighting. He can grant you free passage. In such a case, your army can go through the enemy units but cannot stop there. If 2 enemy armies share the same location, there must be a battle. And note that free passage cannot be granted through a major city. Okay, now let's see the most common case of battle. Red Antigonos enters yellow Ptolemaios location. Enemy armies in the same location. There is a battle. Battle is part of movement, so it is resolved now before any other movement from the same activation segment. Battle ends movement. So Antigonos will not be able to move further even if he wins this battle. Before battle, players compute their strength. Easy. The army's strength is the sum of all its unit strength. The number is parenthesis. So here it's 5 for Antigonos against 3 for Ptolemaios. Then players add local troops. +1 strength for the player who controls the battle location. Here that gives 1 point for Ptolemaios. And again, +2 strength for the player who controls the province where the battle occurs. The battle occurs in the province of Macedonia, and Ptolemaios controls Macedonia, so again, +2 for him. Note that one player can control the province while the other is controlling the location. These two bonuses are separate and additive. Then the resolution. We look at the battle table on the game's player head. Each player rolls 2 dice, and if any die is lower than the general's battle rating, it is increased to this value. Thus, a general battle rating is the minimum value this general can roll on each single die. With a battle rating of 3, Ptolemaios changes his 1 into a 3, while Antigonos changes both his dice into a double 4. The results on the table are the battle scores for each player. The player with the highest score wins. With a score of 3 versus 2, Antigonos wins the battle. And first, the winner of a battle always loses 1 combat unit. This is the cost of battle. Unless he won with the score of at least twice as big. In this case, this is an overwhelming victory and the winner loses nothing. The loser loses all his brown units, that is, mercenary and elephants. So here, Antigonos loses 1 mercenary unit and Ptolemaios loses all his army. The losers' generals are dispersed. That means their plastic figure is put in the dispersed box on the top right of the map. Dispersed means that this general is not eliminated, he is still alive, but he will need to wait until the next campaign to be ready again for activation. On the sequence of play, Ptolemaios, the losing general, now dispersed, will come back on the map at the beginning of next turn red cycle in the reinforcement phase, just before drawing new Tyche cards. Note that if a general is dispersed during the activation phase of the first blue cycle, he will have to play all 3 remaining activation phases with this general missing, and so losing a general at the beginning of a turn is much worse than at the end. Each player has only 2 major generals. Losing 1 to the dispersed box is a serious matter. If there are also wide combat units in the loser's army, these units are not eliminated like mercenary or elephant brown units. Instead, they suffer an attrition roll. The player rolls 1 die and looks at the column that matches the number of his white units, only the white ones, and the number of units, not their strength. For example, Ptolemaios just lost a battle, so first all his brown units are eliminated. Then he has 3 white units left, 2 loyal Macedonians and 1 silver shields. He rolls a die on column 3, he gets a 4, he must lose 1 white unit. He chooses a loyal Macedonian. The remaining white units are dispersed with their generals. He puts a yellow PC marker to remind that these dispersed combat units are owned by the yellow player. They will come back to the map as reinforcements at the beginning of next turn. Sometimes an army can carry political figures with it, heirs, influential women, or Alexander's funeral cart. These figures don't take part in the fight. They don't have any battle strength or rating. But if they belong to the losing side, the winner takes control of all heirs and funeral cart and gains the associated legitimacy points. He cannot take control of the women because such a control requires the play of a special Tyche card, so an influential woman on the losing side of a battle becomes uncontrolled again. She's put on the battle location on the map, and from then she will wait here that some general comes and play her Tyche card again. And what happens if the result is a draw? If both players get the same battle score from the battle table, they both lose 1 combat unit and that's all. But because they cannot stay together in the same location, the attacker goes back to the location he came from. The attacker is the general that was activated and moved into battle. On a result of 9 on the battle table, a general can be killed. The player who got a 9 must roll again on the general loss table. It is even possible that both players get a 9 and roll both on the general loss table. If he is on the winning side or if it is a draw, a general is killed on a result of 6. If he is on the losing side, he dies on a roll of 5 or 6. A dead general is out of the game, forever lost. He is not dispersed, he is dead. And that's all. This is how battles are fought in Successors. Very easy. Let's see a last example before going on. Blue player is controlling Macedonia and Thessalia. Seleucus is leading his main army. Eumenes is his subordinate because he has a lesser seniority. No choice for blue player. Seleucus must be the boss and Eumenes the subordinate. Seleucus' figure is on the map. Eumenes stays on Seleucus' card. Meanwhile, black player sends Peyton to the north, attempting an invasion of an empty Macedonia. He already converted the first location to black political control. It's now blue player's turn, and blue player wants to run toward black threat and attack it. At the beginning of his activation segment, blue player rolls a die on the movement allowance table. He gets a 3, and that's a pity. Had he rolled a 4, a 5, or a 6, he could have let Seleucus there and lead the army with Eumenes. Eumenes is a better leader on the field with a battle rating of 4. But with only 3 movement points, Eumenes cannot reach the black army. So, Seleucus, having 4 movement points, takes the lead and 1, 2, 3, 4, he attacks black general Peyton. Let's go. First, we compute the strength. From his troops, Seleucus has 2 plus 2 equals 4. Peyton has 6. Peyton gets a bonus of plus 1 because he controls the battle's location. But plus 2 for Seleucus, who controls Macedonia, the battle's province. Now they both roll 2 dice. Blue player gets a 9, and black player gets also a 9 because his 1 die becomes a 3 thanks to Peyton's battle rating of 3. No die can be lower than this rating. We check the battle table. Both players get a battle score of 5. This is a draw. Both players loses 1 combat unit. Seleucus chooses a mercenary, while Peyton has no choice but to lose a loyal Macedonian unit. And the attacker, blue army, must return to the location he attacked from. Finally, both players having rolled a 9, they can both lose their general. They roll 1 die each on the general loss table. Because this is a draw, both players look at the first column. And they both roll a 6, so they both lose their general. Peyton dies and Seleucus dies. Blue player cannot choose to lose Eumenes instead because the general who dies is the one who conducted the battle, so the one with the highest seniority. Dead generals are removed from play. They will never come back. Blue and black players have now 1 less general than at the beginning of the game, so they will be able to recruit a new general as a replacement, but next turn only, as we will see very soon. In blue army, Eumenes becomes the leading general. Black player must bring a minor general to take care of his remaining troops. And voila, we will see later that a battle can be a little more complex, but for the moment, you know the basics. You know how to fight a standard battle. A last thing before going on, you can move as many troops as you want, but still, there is a limit to the size of armies. At the end of every blue cycle, that is, when you are done activating all your generals, if you have more than 8 combat units on the same location, you lose 1 combat unit. This is called foraging, when your army is too big to feed on its own resources. And so, with enough time, 1 combat unit per turn, every army will shrink down to 8 combat units. This limit is only 3 units on transit points, so it's good to remember that, as their name suggests, transit points are useful to go from a location to another, but you'd better not stop on them. And now let's see what happens here. At the beginning of the turn, each player draws 4 Tyche cards. Then, one by one, players play their blue cycle. Mainly, they activate all their generals, moving the army and fighting the enemies. But just before that, they did play one Tyche card. What is a Tyche card? First, note that these cards make the rhythm of the game. Each player draws 4 cards at the beginning of the turn, red cycle, then each player plays 1 card at the beginning of his blue cycle, so each player plays 4 blue cycles, 1 per Tyche card. Okay, but what are these Tyche cards and how to use them? There are 3 kinds of Tyche cards, grey, yellow and red. For now, we will just look at grey cards, they are the common ones. When comes the time to play one Tyche card, a player can choose to play the event written on the card. In this case, it's very easy. He reads the text and makes what is written. Then, he discards the card and that's all. Here, yellow player with this Tyche card removes 2 red political control markers from the Hellas province. Okay, but a Tyche card can be used instead for its value. Top left of the card, it is called the operational value. And if you use this value, you don't read the card's text. So, in this example, if you use the 3 operational points, you cannot remove 2 enemy political control from Hellas. Operational points can be used in 5 different ways. First, you can do a forced march. Simple, you activate 1 general, exactly as during the activation segment, but only 1 general. He can move, fight, spend movement points to remove political markers or to roll for siege. And you don't roll the die for movement allowance. Your general's movement points are equal to the operational value of the Tyche card. Regardless of the general initiative rating, it can even be a minor general. And this activation is a bonus. You can activate a general with your Tyche card as a forced march, then activate the same general again during the normal activation phase. Or you can place political control markers with your Tyche card. We already saw this one. You can place a number of political markers equal to the operational value of the Tyche card, only on empty locations without any political markers, enemy or independent, and without enemy combat units. And only within 2 movement points of 1 or several political markers you already have on the map at the time you play the card. Another option, by playing a Tyche card, you can also train new troops. I'm sure you were wondering where players' military troops come from. Each player begins the game with a player mat. This represents his faction, his color. And when the player chooses to spend a Tyche card to train new troops, first he chooses what kind of troops he wants to train, mercenary or loyal Macedonian, brown or white. Then he moves the unit being trained on the training track around his player mat, 1 space for each operational point. Here, with 3 operational points, his mercenary unit moves 3 space. As soon as a mercenary unit reaches space 3, or a loyal Macedonian unit reaches space 7, the new combat unit is created and can be added on the game map as a reinforcement. As you guess, training a loyal unit is much more difficult. For example, with this first Tyche card, red player starts the training of a loyal Macedonian unit, a white counter. It reaches space 3, but it's not enough for a loyal unit, which requires 7 training points, and it's too late for red player to change his mind and create a mercenary instead. No, he must go on. Next turn, he plays another Tyche card for training, 2 points, 2 space on the training track. Next turn again, third Tyche card, 4 points. With the first 2 points, the unit reaches space 7, so it is sent to the map as a reinforcement. 2 training points are remaining, so red player can start a new training. He can choose again which kind of unit he will train, and he moves it 2 spaces. And I will take this opportunity to review all possible ways to get new troops, because as we will see, troops are scarce, and you need to think about getting fresh soldiers as often as possible. Great armies are built over the long term. And first, the easiest way to recruit is by regular reinforcements. These are historical reinforcements, Players get them whatever they do at the beginning of each turn. Each turn but the first one, so they get them 4 times during the whole game. Then you can train new troops, as we just saw, by playing a Tyche card and using its operation value on your faction's training track. Some Tyche cards also add new troops through their event. This one, for example, gives you a free loyal Macedonian unit that would have cost you 7 training points, so it's often a good choice to recruit with event cards when it's possible. And finally, there's the desperate solution. You need troops so badly that you are willing to give up all your activations. So, you get 1 free mercenary unit, only 1, but you don't activate any general during the following activation segment. And so, you know all the ways to recruit new troops in this game. In our next video, we will see more detail on that, and especially where you put these troops, where on the map. But for now, just remember what your options are for growing your armies, and that Tyche cards are your best tool for recruiting. Okay, back to Tyche cards. There are still 2 things you can do with the Tyche card, but these are more specific and seldom used. With the Tyche card, whose value is 3 or 4, you can recruit a new general. Wow, I hear you thinking, but why don't you say that before? It is possible to recruit more generals? Not exactly. In fact, basically you can just replace generals you lost. Generals that were killed in battle after a failed general loss roll. With a 3 or 4 value Tyche card, you can get a new general, but only if your total number of generals stays 2 or lower. Unless in turn 4 or 5, the last 2 turns, when players can get 1 more general up to 3. And these generals must come from the general's reserve. In the standard campaign scenario for 5 players, there are only 3 generals in this reserve: Aristonous, Nearchos and Asandros. After these 3 generals are recruited, no more can be recruited until the end of the game. A new general comes in his home territory with his army. Aristonous arrives in any location in Macedonia with 1 loyal unit and 1 mercenary. Nearchos arrives with 2 mercenary units in any port space, a space with a water-dotted link. Asandros arrives in any location in Caria with 1 loyal unit and 1 mercenary unit. Note that Asandros can be recruited only if Antipatros is dead. So just remember that new generals are scarce, and you'd better take care of those you got at the beginning of the game. The 2 or 3 first players who will lose generals will recruit replacement ones by playing a 3 or 4 value Tyche card, but after that, with an empty reserve, all general loss will be very costly. And finally, with a Tyche card, you can also upgrade a naval unit, but more on that later, when we will talk about sea and boats. And here is what you can do by spending a Tyche card operational value. When it's your turn to play a Tyche card, you can either play it for its event or spend its operation value for one of these 5 actions. At the beginning of each turn, all Tyche cards are reshuffled and each player draws a hand of 4. Then, during the blue cycle, each in turn plays 1 Tyche card, and now you understand how this choice sets the pace of the game and is so important. And finally, what do the 3 different card colors mean? Grey cards are standard cards. They work exactly as we just saw. Yellow cards are called bonus cards. And why bonus? Because when you play one of them, you can play their event and their operational value. You can do both. That's why they are called bonus. Their operational value is a bonus added to its event. With this card, the player can remove a siege marker on the map to slow down a siege conducted by an enemy player, and he can spend the 2 operation points to place political markers or to train combat units and so on. Red cards are called surprise cards, And that's because they can be played at any time, even during another player's turn. Red cards don't have any operational value, so they can be played only for their event. For example, this card can be played during another player's activation, who just attacked and killed one of your generals. This card saves him and sends him to the disperse box instead. When a red card is played, it is discarded but immediately replaced by a new Tyche card. So, when you play a red surprise card, you don't change the number of Tyche cards in your hand. That's very important because that means that you won't play one blue cycle less, the number of blue cycles you play being equal to the number of cards you own. And you can use this rule to your advantage if you have a red card in hand that is useless to you. For example, let's suppose my hand is this one. The first card unlocks the controls of Cleopatra. I hope to use it before the end of the turn. I must keep it. The second card brings new troops, but only if I control Mesopotamia or Lycia Pamphylia. I don't control them yet, so I keep this card also. It's my turn to play a Tyche card. What can I do? Here is the trick. Because I can play or discard a red card at any time, I can discard one just now, then I replace it by drawing a new card. Fine, it's a good card. But because I don't have naval forces and I don't care about my last red card, I can still discard it also and draw again. Okay, that's fine. And now I cannot discard anymore and I choose to play this card. And voila, you know all you need to know about Tyche cards. So you have now a good overview of this game. Successor is all about playing Tyche card and activating your generals to gain political control over provinces. Okay, it seems easy, but some blurry zones still need more focus. For example, you remember this magic table that summarizes how to take control of any type of location. But what if there is an enemy army in the location you want to control? The two first lines are easy. Let's take an example. Red player's army under General Crateros attacks an uncontrolled location, a location without any political control marker. We are in this cell in our table, and thus the location would freely surrender at the surrender segment or lose yellow control for the cost of 2 movement points, but there is Ptolemaios' enemy army defending. Crateros enters the location. There is a battle. If Crateros loses, he is dispersed and disappears from the map, at least until next turn's reinforcements. If there is a draw, Crateros goes back to where he came from. And what if he wins? He just loses one unit and his opponent is dispersed, so Crateros stays alone in the location. Crateros cannot move anymore this activation because any battle stops movement. And according to our table, the location will automatically surrender during the next surrender segment. It is the same if Crateros attacks Ptolemaios in a yellow controlled location. If he wins the battle, Ptolemaios is dispersed and the yellow location becomes automatically red in the next surrender segment. Against an independent location, it is exactly the same, except that a siege roll is needed in the surrender segment. And even this would be the same again for an attack on a major city location, whether uncontrolled or independent. The problem arises in the last cell of our table, when a player attacks a major city controlled by another player. In this case, the defender, Yellow Ptolemaios, owns the fortified city and he can hide behind its walls. Every time an army sits in a major city it controls, there is a fortress in the location. This is the major city by itself, with thick walls behind which soldiers and people can hide. So let's suppose here that Ptolemaios had traveled back to Pella with Alexander's funeral cart. This is a critical affair because, as you remember, escorting the funeral cart back from Babylon to Pella can be worth 10 legitimacy points, so it would be a pity if Crateros could steal the cart just as it enters the city. Okay, so this is red player's activation segment and Crateros enters Pella's location. This is a major city controlled by yellow player, so at the time Crateros attacks, Yellow must decide if he hides some units and people behind the city's walls. Every major city in the game can hold 2 combat units and any number of individual figures. So here, of course, a yellow player hides the funeral cart inside the city. Then, because he has the same strength as his opponent, but a lesser battle rating, the odds are against him and he chooses to cower behind the walls until some reinforcements can help. He hides 2 combat units and his general, Ptolemaios. The remaining 3 mercenary units cannot enter the city, no more room, and they stay in Pella but outside in front of the walls. And now a standard battle takes place but in the plain, in front of the walls. All units behind the walls don't participate in the battle. That means that 5 red strength points will attack only 3 yellow strength points. But also, Crateros will use his battle rating, while Ptolemaios will not. If a general hides behind city walls, he cannot lead his troops into battle. Now, if Red Crateros loses the battle, or if it's a draw, Crateros is dispersed or he moves back to his former location. In both cases, Yellow Ptolemaios stays in Pella just as before. But what if Crateros wins? All defeated mercenary units are eliminated, but only the 3 units that actually fought the battle. The other 2 stays unarmed in the city, and Ptolemaios is not dispersed because he didn't fight the battle. And the cart is not stolen by red player. Fine, but still, there is a cost to pay because from now, Ptolemaios, his 2 mercenary and his funeral cart are trapped inside the city. They are besieged. This is the end of red player's activation and the game stays as is. Both armies sharing the same location but yellow forces inside the walls and red forces outside, and Pella is still controlled by yellow player. This is the only case where 2 opposite armies can share the same location. And that's because actually they don't share it. It's exactly as if there were 2 locations within Pella, the inside of the city and the outside. When it is yellow player activation segment, Ptolemaios can decide to leave the city and attack Crateros in the plain, exactly as if he came from an adjacent location. And he can do so leaving the funeral cart inside the walls, so if he loses the battle, the funeral cart is still safe inside the city. Let's say in our example that this is a draw. Both generals loses 1 combat unit and the attacker, Yellow Ptolemaios, must retreat to where he came from, so back into the city again. If Yellow brings another general with a relieving army, this general can attack Red Crateros, but Ptolemaios would not participate because he is inside the city. Always see the inside and the outside as 2 different locations. And what happens if the situation stays like that until red player's turn? At the time of surrender segment, red player automatically rolls for siege, because this is a siege. The fact that yellow army is hidden behind the walls doesn't change anything. Red player rolls a die and adds siege points to the city, and if he reaches 3 siege points, the city falls. But I know, among you, my dear viewers, some did notice that red player cannot roll for siege because he doesn't meet the prerequisite of 3 combat units. Good point for you if you saw this one. A force without enough combat unit to roll for siege can stay there. There is still a state of siege, yellow inside and red outside, but no siege roll. Note that what counts here is the number of combat units and not their strength. Now let's suppose red player has 1 more combat unit. Okay, we can go on. He rolls a 6 and gets 2 siege points. In his following activation segment, red player can spend 2 movement points to roll again for siege. This time he gets 1 more siege points and that's it, the fall of the city of Pella. For all units inside the city, this is exactly as if they just lost a battle. All mercenary units are eliminated, Ptolemaios is dispersed, and red player gets the ownership of the funeral cart. As political control is concerned, it's just like a regular siege. If the city falls during a surrender segment, political control immediately goes to the besieging player. Here, the successful siege roll happened during the activation segment, so red player just removes yellow control without adding his own. And now let's summarize. The problem arises when a player attacks a major city controlled by an opponent. For all other cases, no special rules. When a major city is under siege, 2 combat units and as many individual people as wanted can be kept inside. There can be no battle inside a city. To defeat his opponents, the besieged force must go out and fight outside, while the besieger must roll for siege. He proceeds exactly as if the city were empty. When he accumulates 3 siege points, the city falls and forces inside incurs the same result as when defeated in battle. But between the beginning of a siege and the fall of the city, time can go by. The state of siege lasts as long as an enemy stays outside on the city's location, even if less than 3 combat units. During this time, the city is still controlled by the besieged player. Especially, the besieged player can spread political control markers from the city with the play of a Tyche card. For isolation purposes, a besieged city is a valid source for both players, besieger and besieged. And finally, the besieged player cannot receive any reinforcement. And that's it. Siege is a kind of attack, even if a slow one. So if you besiege a major city controlled by a player other than the usurper, you lose your champion legitimacy. And now we have a complete view of what battle is. And with your armies, you feel ready to attack whatever you want, enemy, independent forces, with or without walls. But still, the picture is not finished, because a large part of war lies in the maneuvering, and often the outcome of the conflict is set well before battle. Let's travel to Phoenice. Green player controls the major city of Tyros, and Black army under Peyton is in Arados, ready to pounce on its prey. But in Sidon, Green player put a small garrison of loyal Macedonian troops under Alcetas, one of his minor generals. It's Black player activation. He rolls 2 and gets 2 movement points for Peyton. And 2 is not enough to walk around Alcetas to the city of Tyros. What a shame, isn't it? What a shame that Green player can so easily block a powerful enemy with a single unit under a minor general. But there is a solution, and it's called Overrun. An overrun is possible whenever a moving army has 5 times more combat units than an enemy force on its way. In this case, it can just move through the enemy, destroying it as it goes by. Note that what matters is the ratio of combat units and not their strength. Here, Black player has 5 times more combat units than Green, but not 5 times more strength, and still it's okay for an overrun. The defeated army suffers the same losses as if it lost a regular battle. Green player loses his minor general and his 1 loyal Macedonian unit. The winner loses nothing and go on with his movement. Black Peyton can safely move to Tyros for 2 movement points. Of course, an overrun is an act of aggression, and it costs the status of champion if against a non-usurper player. Fine, and thus, if you want to block access to your territory with garrison, you'd better use several stacked mercenary units instead of a single strong loyalist. Back to the beginning, Black Peyton wants to take the city of Tyros. This time the road is clear. There is just a threatening green army in Triparadisos under General Perdiccas. No need to worry, isn't it? This is not exactly safe, because when Peyton enters Sidon, Perdiccas can try to intercept his movement. Interception is made by any enemy force adjacent to a location you are about to enter. Adjacent through a plain 1 movement point path only. Never through a mountain or straight dotted path, never through a naval path. Interception is possible only in a non-controlled location or a location that the intercepting player is controlling. No interception against an independent or an enemy-controlled location, even if it is not the enemy currently moving. For example here, if Black Army enters a red-controlled location, Green player cannot intercept. And interception is not possible if there is already an enemy force in the interception location. So, if Black player moves Peyton to pick up a unit on his way to Tyros, Green Perdiccas cannot intercept. Now back to the beginning. Sidon is uncontrolled and empty, so Peyton moves forward and Perdiccas tries to intercept him. He rolls a die and succeeds if the result is strictly greater than his initiative rating. Perdiccas' initiative is 3, so if he rolls 1, 2 or 3, he misses and nothing happens. He cannot intercept and Peyton goes on his way without concern. But if Perdiccas rolls a 4, a 5 or a 6, there is an interception. The Green Army immediately moves to Sidon and cuts Peyton's movement. And then it's up to Peyton, Black player, to decide what will follow. First, he can throw in the towel and cancel his movement. This is called a withdrawal. Black Army goes back to its previous location and this ends its movement for this activation. Or, Black player can decide to stay there and accept the fight. In such a case, because it is Black player's activation segment, Black Army is still the attacker and Green Interceptor Army is the defender. Okay, this is interception. And this allows you to guard large routes with only one strong army ready to stop any unwelcome passerby. Some situations can be more complex. Here, Black Army under General Peyton would like to move as straight as possible toward the south toward Egypt. First, he announces that he moves to Tyros. 3 different Green armies can intercept. They can try their role one by one in any order of Green player's choice. Note that in the case where different players try to intercept, they roll in turn order. Here, Demetrios misses. Perdiccas misses also. Green player, having failed both major generals, does not want to try with his minor general alone, but it's too late. A player must roll for all interceptions he previously announced, so he must roll for his minor general and must intercept if he succeeds. But he fails. No interception, Peyton can go on. Next location, Peyton can overrun the Green minor general with a unit ratio of 5 versus 1. But other Green forces can try interception before the overrun. Interception always occurs just before the movement it tries to intercept. 2 Green armies can try. Demetrios already tried against the first move, but he can try again. Every army can roll for interception at each step, each new location of the enemy's movement. Demetrios rolls a 4 and succeeds. He advances and absorbs the minor general. There will be no overrun. And it's not over. Attalos, the minor general, declared an interception, so he rolls for it. And he passes, so he moves and is absorbed also. So, wisely, Black player chooses to withdraw in front of such a huge interception force. And that's all for his movement. He will not reach the tempting lands of Egypt, but instead wait for the next surrender segment to roll for the siege of Tyros. And what about the other way? When instead of running to fight the invader, you want to run the other way, you want to flee. This is called evasion. And as you will see, it is very close to interception. Here is an in-game situation. It is blue player's turn. Blue player activates his general Seleukos and marches straight against red Lysimachos. With 2 units of silver shields, Seleukos is far more powerful than Lysimachos, a strength of 8 versus 3. Seleukos attacks the city of Tyros. Lysimachos could hide behind the walls with 2 mercenary units, but with no other army around, he doesn't expect help anytime soon, so he prefers to flee. With Evasion, an attacked general can flee 1 or 2 locations away. During this evasion movement, he can only go through plain paths and only through uncontrolled or friendly controlled locations. Of course, there can be no enemy combat units on the way. A friendly combat unit clears any location for evasion even if enemy controlled. So here, as his first evasion location, Lysimachos could flee to Damascus or Galaditis. He could not go to Sidon, which is independent. Independent means controlled by an independent tribe, and they are enemy to all players. Lysimachos also could not evade to Acche because it is the location Seleucus is coming from. Then he can evade 1 location more to Hierosolima or to Triparadeisos, because even if this location is controlled by an enemy player, yellow player, it holds a red army and evasion is always possible to a location containing at least a friendly combat unit. But first, he must pass a die roll. With a roll of 3, Lysimachos should fail. In this case, he stays there is a battle, and in this battle he cannot use any local troop bonus. A force that tries to evade gives up the help of local troops. But here Lysimachos passes his initiative roll. Wait, he rolled a 3 that is not greater than his initiative rating, so how is it possible? The answer is here. Never forget your general's special abilities. Lysimachos, not so brave, is very good at evading. With a roll of 3, he passes his evade roll. He can move 1 or 2 locations out of the battle. 1, 2. He absorbs the small red force in its final location. But note that an evading army cannot drop off nor pick up troops in the location it passes through. And voila, note that if Lysimachos is attacked again, even during the same turn, he can evade again. There is no limit to the number of evasion as long as the general passes his evasion rolls. And now, before wrapping up the core of the rules, we need to talk about one last but large topic, naval movement and the ensuing naval battles. And let's begin with the golden rule of naval movement. A non-intuitive rule, but very important to remember. You don't need fleets to do naval movement. There are fleets in the game, there are 8 special ship tokens, but you don't need them to do naval movement. We will see very soon what these fleet tokens are made for, but your armies don't need them to cross the sea. Naval routes are blue dotted lines across the seas. They cost 1 movement point only. An army in Sparta can move to Cyclades for just 1 movement point. And that's all. That's basically naval movement. You can do it as a regular activation or as a forced march with a Tyche card. Ships that are used to transport the troops are not represented as tokens or units. You don't need fleets to move your armies on blue dotted lines. Still, there are rules for naval movement that you must follow. And the main one, you are allowed only 1 naval movement per activation segment. If Seleucus moves to Cyclades, Crateros cannot move to Gortyn. Or the other way, if Crateros moves to Gortyn, Seleucus cannot move to Cyclades. Whether you have fleet tokens or not, you cannot change it, only 1 naval movement per activation phase. Now, what is a naval movement? If Seleucus spends 2 movement points, 1 to go to Cyclades and 1 to go to Halicarnassos, is it 1 or 2 naval movements? 1 naval movement is a movement from an embarkation port to a destination port, whatever the number of sea-dotted blue paths you use. And during all this movement, your army stays at sea. So, for example, if there is an enemy army in Cyclades, Seleucus can do his naval movement without having to stop and battle in Cyclades. Green Army is on land while Seleucus is just passing by on his boat. Note that Green Army cannot intercept because interception is not allowed on the sea. Evasion is not possible either by sea. If Green player attacks Seleucus in Sparta, Seleucus is trapped. Sparta is a dead end, Seleucus cannot evade by sea. Still, a general moving by sea can be intercepted on his destination location, where his army disembarks on firm land. Green Army tries to intercept Red Seleucus landing. If it succeeds, Seleucus can choose to withdraw. But where? To the location he comes from, and this location is his embarkation point back to Sparta. And so you must look at sea movement as one long journey. You can disembark on a location with an enemy army, it's just as if you enter this location by land. He can evade, and if he doesn't, there's a battle. If the battle is a draw and you must retreat, you retreat to where you came from, your embarkation area. With up to 4 movement points during an activation, you can mix land and naval movements. But there are restrictions. If you move by sea, you must begin or end your overall movement with naval movement. You cannot move by land, then by sea, then by land again. With 3 movement points, Seleucus can move from Corinthos to Halicarnassos. First 1 point by land, then 2 by sea. If he begins his activation in Sparta, he can move to Sardeis with 3 movement points also. First 2 by sea, then 1 by land. But he could not go from Corinthos to Sardeis because this would wage a movement by sea between 2 movements by land, and this is forbidden. Beware, you can spend 2 movement points to remove a political control marker with a siege roll if needed. And this expenditure is a land movement. So, Seleucus could not move to Sparta by land, then to Cyclades by sea, and spend 2 movement points to get rid of green political marker. No, because it would be a sequence of land, sea, land. Okay, so you can move an army by sea once per activation segment or as a force march with a Tyche card, and you don't need a fleet to do so. Transportation ships are abstracted, but they still exist and they are subject to certain limitations. During a naval movement, you cannot move more than 8 combat units. Generals, heirs, influential women and the funeral cart don't count, only combat units, but all combat units. For example, Seleucus starts a naval movement with 8 combat units on board. That's okay. He sails to Cyclades, where he drops off his 4 loyal Macedonian units. Then, he goes on his journey to the island of Rhodos, where he picks up new troops, 3 mercenary units, to bring them to Gortyn. Well, no, he cannot do that, because during this naval movement, a total of 11 combat units went on board of his ships. Even if at no time during the trip there were more than 8 units on board. What counts is the cumulative number. Here 11, it's too many, so this movement is forbidden. But I hear you think, wait, do you mean that if you respect the 8 unit limit, you can do this movement with drop-off and pick-up? Yes, you can. Dropping off and picking up don't incur that you stop your naval movement. This is not like disembarking. Seleucus can make 1 naval movement for 3 movement points from where he is in Ephesus to Gortyn via Cyclades where he drops off 2 units, then through Rhodos where he picks up 3 units. He didn't move more than 8 units by sea, okay, and this counts only as 1 naval movement despite of pick-up and drop-off. Picking up and dropping off units don't interrupt naval movement unless there are enemy units in intervening location. An army in naval movement cannot drop off units into a location with enemy units. Red Seleucus could sail by Cyclades to Rhodos and further, but if he wants to drop off units to attack Green General Perdiccas, he must stop. He cannot drop off units into an enemy location and carry on his naval movement. Okay, that's fine. You know how to sail and transport your troops across the seas. But, as you guess, the sea can also be a battlefield. There are transport ships, but there are also warships. Here they are. There are 8 war fleets in the game. War fleets. That means they are not made to transport troops, but to attack enemy ships on the sea. In other words, these 8 fleet tokens represents players' military control over the sea. So first, how do you get these war fleet tokens? 6 of them come with the control of naval provinces: Macedonia, Caria, Kypros, Rhodos, Aegyptos, and Phoenice. Small ships are printed on the map as reminder. So, for example, if yellow player gets Ptolemaios as one of his 2 starting generals, he also gets the control of Aegyptos. And so, he receives Aegyptos Warfleet token. This token goes to yellow player's faction mat because this fleet does not belong solely to General Ptolemaios. It belongs collectively to yellow player, so to yellow faction. This link between a province and a fleet is shown on the province card. You get the card, you get the fleet. If the province's control goes to another faction, this new faction takes also the corresponding fleet. And if nobody controls the province, the fleet token goes back to its starting box. Things are a little different for the 2 remaining fleets. The fleets of Athenae is given to the player who controls the major city of Athenae. So it is not linked to the control of a province, but to the control of a city. And the last one, it's Kilikia fleet, the one with the black sails. It is named after a province, but it is not given to the player controlling this province. To get this fleet, you need to play the corresponding Tyche card. You play the card for the event, you get the fleet. It's as simple as that. Every war fleet has a strength, 1 or 2 at the fleet's creation. A player owning a fleet can improve its strength when playing a Tyche card. In order to do that, the player must play a card with a value of 4 operation points. Here, on his turn, yellow player can play this card with a value of 4. Then, he just flips his fleet counter, which has now a strength of 2 instead of 1. Okay, you can earn new war fleets for your faction, and you can improve them by playing Tyche card, but why? How do you use them? First of all, you can just gather a large war fleet to show off your military power. If you remember, the player owning the most powerful fleet gains 3 victory points, with a minimum strength of 3. So here, yellow player cannot claim the largest fleet victory points. But if later he gains a new fleet, with a total strength of 3, he gets the bonus, 3 victory points. If there is a tie with another player, no player has the largest fleet and no one gets the victory points bonus. But Successors, thankfully, is not a Eurogame, and you don't gather a war fleet only to earn victory points. No, you gather a warship to fight on the sea to do naval battles. To be more precise, war fleets are made to hinder your opponent's naval movements. Let's take an example. Blue General Seleukos would like to move to Sparta. This is a naval movement and it costs 2 movement points. But yellow player has a naval war fleet and he can try to intercept a blue naval movement. To attack an enemy convoy, first you must have war fleets. Yellow player has 3 points worth of warships, so that's okay. Then, the movement to be intercepted must occur within this fleet's range, that is, within 2 movement points from any yellow-controlled port, 2 movement points only through sea links, the blue dotted lines. Yellow player just declares that he will use his naval force to attack blue naval movement, and there is an immediate naval battle. The resolution is the same as for a land battle, using the same battle table, but with only warship strength. Land units don't count. In our example, yellow player's strength is 3 and blue player's strength is 0. Blue player has no warship at all. Column 3 versus column 0. Still, there can be a draw if yellow player rolls between 2 and 4. Note that generals cannot be used to modify the dice roll. With a dice roll of 6, yellow player wins, and blue player doesn't even need to roll. When interceptor player wins, the naval movement is cancelled. Here blue player's army stays in its embarkation port, and then all moving units incurs an attrition roll. Blue player had 5 mercenary units on board. He rolls 1 die in column 5. With a roll of 3, he loses 1 unit, Note that the winning interceptor loses nothing. So, as you see, players are better off keeping a naval warfleet, mainly to prevent opponents from using naval movement. And because a player can do only one naval movement per activation segment, after a successful naval attack, he cannot try any other naval movement, so warships are a very effective way to deny naval movement. And now let's look at a little more advanced example. Blue player is about to invade a Crete island with his general Seleucus. He declares a naval movement. Then, immediately, his opponents react. Yellow, black and red players all want to stop him. And first, we see that black player won't be able to attack. He has warships, but his bases are too far. He cannot reach blue fleets with only 2 movement points. Yellow and red players can. Note that there is no such range limitation for blue player. Blue player can use his own warships to support his movement, even if he doesn't control any port within 2 movement points. Let's say blue player has been planning his naval movement for a long time and did have time to gather his warships, while yellow and red must react to his surprise movement and can only mobilize warships from surrounding ports. Okay, so red and yellow players both declare they want to intercept blue naval movement. They now resolve their naval battle in player order. Let's say red player is first player. First naval battle, red versus blue. Red has 1 point of naval strength, blue has 2. They both roll 2 dice on the battle table. Red gets a final score of 1 and 2 for blue. So blue wins. And note that there is no die roll for general loss because generals do not take part in naval battles. When the attacker loses, all his warships are dispersed. You remember, that means that his warship tokens are put in the dispersed box under a red marker just to remember that these units belong to him. Red player will recover these warships at the beginning of next turn during the reinforcement phase. And so, he won't be able to use them during all the remaining blue cycles. Just as for land battles, a naval battle at the beginning of a turn can be far more damaging. And that's all for red naval attack. No other losses, and note that warships are never destroyed. They are just dispersed until next turn. Having won the naval battle, blue should be able to carry on his movement to Crete Island. But yellow player did also declare a naval attack, so there is now a second naval battle. This time between yellow warship with a strength of 3 and blue warships strength of 2. Note that if yellow player wins and cancel blue naval movement, blue fleets are also dispersed. In a naval battle, the loser fleet is always dispersed. But here, let's say it's a draw, and in this case, nothing happens. No fleet dispersed and no interception. Blue naval movement can go on to its destination. And that's it. That's all you have to know about naval movement and naval battles. Just a few little things before closing this chapter. Every time a warship is dispersed after a lost naval battle, if it is on its upgraded side, it is flipped back to its basic side. So, when I said you never lose warships in battle, that's not entirely true. You don't lose your warship token, but it is flipped to its weaker side. Another thing to know, of course, a naval battle is an act of war. So, if yellow player tries to attack blue naval movement with his warships, and if blue player is not the usurper, yellow player loses his status of champion and its 3 legitimacy points. Then, there are special rules about major cities that are also ports. A major city is a square area on the map. Let's look at the city of Tyros, and let's suppose it is controlled by green player. If, let's say, red player wants to take control of this city, as you know, he must declare a siege and accumulate 3 siege points. But in the special case of a port, the besieging player incurs a penalty of -1 on all his siege die rolls if he doesn't have any warship. Here, there is no range consideration. If red player has any warship, He doesn't get the penalty, whether or not he controls any port in the vicinity. If, for example, green player has some troops inside the city with, let's say, Heracles, a royal heir, he can flee through naval movement despite the state of siege because he doesn't have to pass through Red Army. He flees by boat on the sea. Red player can only try to attack this naval movement with his warships, but he can do that only if he controls a port within a range of 2 naval movement points. Here this is not the case, so red player just witnesses Heracles' escape without being able to prevent it. And finally, let's talk about Transmediterranean links. There are 3 such links on the map. For all rules, they are exactly the same as regular sea path, except that they cost 2 movement points instead of 1. For all rules, but with some exceptions. And first, naval battles. To be able to intercept a naval movement, you must control a port within 2 movement points, but not through a Transmediterranean link. A yellow control port in Libya could not attack a blue naval movement from Rhodos to Crete. Also, you remember that with a Tyche card, you can spread your influence and gain control of empty areas within a range of 2 movement points from areas you already control. But not through Transmediterranean links. A player controlling Crete cannot expand his control to Libya just by playing a Tyche card. And that's all for the exceptions. For isolation, for example, Transmediterranean links can be used. Here, Libya is not isolated because it can link back to a yellow controlled major city. And voila, you know all the basic rules and are quite ready to play a game of Successors. You know how to move, you know how to fight, how to control territories, how to siege, to use your fleets. You'll find all these handy player aids ready to download on the game's Board Game Geeks dedicated page. In the next video, I will make an inventory of all specific units, battle units, royal heirs, influent women, and elephant, of course. Then we will dig together into the Tyche cards deck, because it's important for you to know what cards you can find in an actual game. And finally, I will wrap up all this into convenient player aids. If you need, take a little rest and let's meet again in the next video.